My name is Miranda and I'm the CEO of Steps Charity Worldwide, and I'm very pleased today to have here with me Miranda, who's kindly giving her time to the charity and to families impacted by learning conditions. Miranda, thank you very much for your time, and over to you.
Thank you. Hello, yes, my name's Miranda, and I am primarily a chartered physiotherapist. I've been working with accessibility and enablement for over 15 years, especially for lower limb conditions and amputation. I'm going to talk about access to school, but a sort of caveat: I'm not really going to cover the financial side, which I appreciate it's a big problem, but I will signpost you to some support at the end of the presentation. So first thing to think about is the Equality Act, which came in 2010. It does state schools mustn't discriminate against pupils because of their disability. This is great, but also quite an umbrella term. They are talking about any type of disability at all. And so they do say that what the school should do to allow access and use of all the facilities is reasonable adjustment. And the definition of that is wishy-washy, I would say. It is supposed to allow children to not just get the education they need, but to participate at the same level as their peers in everything to do with the school. And reasonable adjustments is very subjective, so we'll talk a little bit about that later. The other really key thing I want to pull out of that act was that it's anticipatory. So before the child has an issue, we should have addressed it. Before they get into the building and find they can't get to a class, we should know about that in advance and have done the adjustments, and it shouldn't be done after we found a problem unless we've missed it. So there isn't really a set system or any best practice guidelines on assessing a school. So this is something that I've done before, and basically we look at these key areas. So access is quite an obvious one. Exhaustion is also important because for a lot of movement limitations, there's so much extra energy required to perform movements that a child might be able to go up and down the stairs quite happily, but after they've done it 4 times in a row for every lesson, it becomes a bit much. So we have to think about overload as well as a single episode of being able to do something. Dignity is really important. That's often to do with changing and having access to bathroom facilities and things like that. And then really important, inclusion. So hopefully this isn't too overwhelming, but this is the approach that we would usually take. I have had a school where we've had 12 people of all different professions doing the review, and I've walked around on my own. It is a question of what you have access to sometimes. Personally, I think if you can only have one clinician, I would pick the occupational therapist, but it has to be somebody who also knows the needs of the child. So it's that balance, and you know, who will actually come out, who has experience, and asking your clinicians if they can't do it, is there somebody else that could maybe take them round who has got experience? But there is a possibility to do it as a parent as well. So you want to know, to start with, what the child's schedule is, and we want to do a walkthrough of their day-to-day. Again, I had a child whose school have different lessons every single day in a 2-week rotation, and what we did in that case was take a map of the school, their lesson plan, and work out everywhere they had to go, and then do the walkthrough, so we didn't have to do 2 weeks of walking. And we're going in thinking, what's the current situation? We're not starting with problems. We want to work through the whole day, highlight where we see limitations, and then we're going to confront them after we've done that process. So we want to think right from the beginning of the day, how do you get to school? Is there accessible parking? What's it like? Is it really useful? Are there 35 parents that want to use it and one bay? Can you really open the doors to get the wheelchair out? And can they get from there to where they've got to start their day? A lot of schools start in the playground, so can they get from the playground then to their classroom? And then we want to walk through those lessons, and we want to mark down which type of lesson it is. So I call book and table lessons the lessons where that's all you really need is the book. There's no special equipment, you need somewhere to sit, and we want to mark those down to start with. Then special equipment lessons. Now I'm thinking chemistry, DT, things like that, where you've got big equipment that can't really be moved or changed rooms. You want to see whether they can get in the room in the first place, and then what they're likely to be using for this next term. DT, you have things quite often where you're using your feet to make it move, but holding it with your hands, and just marking down. Again, at this point, we're not going for that's not going to work, that's not going to work. We are just marking down the limitations. We're not addressing them yet. And then moving lessons. Now, moving lessons are often in really lovely and accessible rooms, but what is the protocol? What are they going to be doing this term? And how will your child be treated in that situation? So is sports going to be football and they have a completely separate plan for your child to do something that's inclusive, or are they going to be sat on their own? Find out what the idea is at the moment. Then beyond lessons, we want to make sure again that they're included, that they're safe, and that the time it takes to get somewhere isn't inhibitory. So break time, do they have time to get from where their lesson is to drop off their books, for example, and then actually have a break? Because the kids do need a break, but if the whole time is taken up just trying to move around, they're not getting that rest. Are they included in school trips? What's the process for that? Lunch, after school groups can be quite a big category of things. So are there things that your child currently is doing or would like to be part of? Look at those specific groups to start with. That doesn't limit them. If it changes, then we need to look again. Exams are really important. How are they going to be looked after in exams? Are their needs met? And emergency procedures. For me, this is a big one, because what a child can do in a calm day is very different to an emergency situation. Does the teacher know what the difference might be for that child? Does the child know what's going to happen? Has the teacher considered how they're going to handle the separate procedure for the rest of the children? And have they done a run through? Is a run through appropriate? That is making sure that in the heat of the moment, there's not a big problem that they haven't actually really addressed. And within that, it's also worth thinking how busy the school is. You've walked through on an empty day, your child will be changing classes with everyone else in the corridor. So bear that in mind. And then the last thing I've got on that list is the bathroom. So access to bathroom isn't just getting into it, it's, is there an accessible bathroom, but it's halfway across campus? And then once they get in, can they do everything they need to do in the bathroom safely, cleanly? And what happens if they do have a problem and get stuck in the bathroom? What's the process then? If something like they have to take their leg off to use the bathroom, what if they can't get it back on? What's the school planning for that? And then privacy for adjustments. There's a lot of reasons that your child might need 5 minutes out to sort themselves out, but they don't want to do it in the middle of the class. And is there somewhere they can safely and dignifiedly do that? So you've got now a list of what their day is like, and you've marked out problems and the kind of lessons they're going to address. So then we've got to try and strike a balance. In an ideal world, everything's sorted. But we know that's not really the case. So where you see the problems, really think about which are the most important, and start with those. Then we want to think about policy or physical, and by that I mean the change that needs to take place. Now, it's easier, I think, our minds always go for the physical. It's much clearer what a physical change would be, but then you've got the barrier of costs. Whereas it might come down to policy, what the school does, because that's what the school policy says. And this is the point where we have to ask lots of questions. Why, if we take the book and table lessons, why is that always in that room? Is it because the teacher can't carry too many books? Is there an alternative? Why are you not willing to make a compromise here? And ask lots of questions until you get really down to what the problem is. It's not always that people are trying to be difficult, it is just it doesn't occur to them until they're questioned on it. We also want to think about whether we're being overcautious. Maybe it might sound like the easiest option is to have the child in the same classroom all day. That might not be necessary. That child is quite capable of moving around, but there are other things where there's really a limitation. And then bad days. This is one that often, for many things, you really have to think about what the scenario would be in the worst situation. But again, if we try and implement everything for their worst possible day, we're limiting their independence and what they're actually allowed to do. So think about bad days, think about what the process would be there, if maybe they have to have some of their lessons over Zoom. I'm talking about when 1 or 2 days at a time. I'm not talking after a big operation, they have to take a month out. But think about how that would work, but don't make it the main plan. Then I've got there too many cooks. I have an opinion, obviously. Like I said, I did it with 12 people at one point. You do have to compromise with the school, but at the end of the day, what is going to work for you and your child and their emotional health as well? I've got how long does it take there, and that ties into it. We had one child who was always late for a lesson because the rest of the class could run across a field and they couldn't. And when we spoke to the child about it, they said, well, as long as I can have a seat at the back and no one makes a fuss, I don't mind. And that, as long as they are happy, then why do we need to change everything to make them feel uncomfortable when they're actually quite satisfied? I've also put on their attitudes. I'm not really going to go into that because that's a whole other topic, but it is worth considering that sometimes the big barrier is knowledge and understanding of the condition, and that might be a big chunk of what it takes to get them on the same page as you. So I'm going to go back to that long list. We've got all this information now. We also want the school's risk assessments, if we can, or at least to feed into them with the specific needs of your child. And we want to then confront certain things. So is there a problem with how you can get into the school? Schools are not obliged to provide accessible parking, but they should make allowances and to the best of their ability for your needs or your child's needs. And book and table lessons, there are very few real reasons I've come across that can't be altered. It is often just a habit of what they're used to doing. Special equipment lessons can be the tough one because it might be to do with safety, and this is one where you have to think about what you and your child want. Do they want to be part of this lesson? Is there a version of it that is safe and accessible for them? Ideally, we would change the equipment, but not every school is going to have the funding available for that. Moving lessons, this might be about knowledge of the teacher. That football example for me is a really clear one. If you have a football pitch, is possible to split it down the middle and have walking football on one side, running football on the other, and then the children that want to can switch halfway through the lesson. That way the child with special movement needs is still part of the team, is still doing the activity, and you're fulfilling all criteria. So it's knowing what the school has outlaid as really necessary. Do they have to have cardiovascular fitness every 2 weeks? There are ways of adapting it within the capacity of the child. And then the outside of lesson things, sometimes it might be a compromise. What I have seen before is children have to sit in the corridor to eat their lunch, which is just not acceptable. And it's that dignity thing again. If they have to get into school and there's a ramp, but they have to navigate the bins to get in, can the school move those bins? Would that be sufficient? Why have they got to go around all the dirty areas just to get into the school? And the same is true for lunch and break time. Is it an option to have a classroom with some of their friends where they can all have a nice social lunch together? And after school groups, one of the things I've seen is that maybe all the after school groups happen in a mobile and the child can't get into the mobile, and it's to do with being able to lock down the whole school. Is there a compromise where some of the groups can happen in the school and someone's in charge of locking up a little bit later? And then the additional things that perhaps are worth thinking about with that is, if it's not just a policy change but some help is needed, is it a big building change, or is it a auxiliary staff member who perhaps isn't a teacher, who doesn't need to be there all the time, which might address some of the funding issues? So it's often thinking around the problem. Bathrooms are much harder. If they cannot use the bathroom, is that because it doesn't exist and it would need building, or is it because it's used as a cupboard, which still happens? And is it a question of putting in a new procedure for a member of staff, the school nurse, to help in case of an emergency? Is that an education of the nurse that needs to happen? Or are there bigger safeguarding issues that the school sees with that access? So I'm sorry, it's lots and lots of things to think about, but hopefully these are the takeaways that we can get from it. Is first of all, decide if you want to engage clinicians and which ones are suitable. So again, I would opt for an OT if you have contact with one and they know the child. Then get from the school the schedule and the risk assessment for the child. If you're looking at transitioning schools, they often have an introductory day and they will have done a lot of planning before that. So contact them before to see if you and your family can go around beforehand so that your child can come to the intro day and it's already addressed their needs for that day. And what might be necessary for them to go to that school. Talk to other parents. So STEPS can connect you to other parents, but there are people who've been through it too, have faced the same fights and challenges and had more advice. Do a physical walkthrough. Most schools are open out of term time. You do need to organise it, and you might have to walk around with the teacher, but actually physically go to the school and have a look. Prioritise, then, I would say, is really key. Pick your battles and, you know, maybe come back later and pick another battle, but get the first ones addressed first. And then create some suggestions for policy changes, work with the teachers at that point, and then discuss the possibility of physical adaptations. Schools cannot request the money from you, but they should be able to accept funding. So if it's from a charity or yourself, if they don't, really address why. Is it because they're worried it looks like they've asked for the money? Is there some paperwork you can go through? And if you're hitting a brick wall, then you need to bring in some external support. The council should be supporting you. The citizen advice should be there for advice. And so I've put some useful links. I'm not sure you'll be able to click through them, but they'll be up while we're going through the questions. So if you need some support, there are people you can reach out to.
Thank you, Miranda. That was a very insightful presentation, and I hope that our parents or carers are following us have taken a lot of notes, and I'm sure they have many questions. As I said before, we have received some of your questions already by email, but I'm certain that some of you want to send them through the Q&A section, so please do so now so we can go through them. So the first question that I have, Miranda, is related to a risk assessment. We have a family of a 1-year-old diagnosed with DDH who is going to be in a cast for quite some time. And the teacher basically, I've told them that they will need to be involved in a risk assessment, and they would like to understand what does this involve.
So a risk assessment, all schools have to have them for everything essentially, and usually they're pretty good at doing them. There isn't an exact protocol. It does depend on the situation, but it's trying to identify where there might be a risk of harm in any way, emotional, physical, and what to do to try and avoid it, and then also what to do if it does happen. And probably in this case, the teacher will have a basic risk assessment for the whole class that they will need to then add to. And I think the key thing that the parents are going to be involved in is knowledge. So knowing what the child can and can't do and what the specific risks are. In the case of a cast, things like being in the same position for more than 2 hours, the teacher may not be aware of that. And making sure that before they go, they're really aware of what some of the risks are, and if the cast gets wet, what the teacher should do in that situation. And then also just reviewing the other risks identified and seeing if the procedure is suitable for their child. So it will be a negotiation probably, but going there knowing this is the specific needs of my child will really help.
And should they receive a copy of the risk assessment?
You should be entitled to see the risk assessment, and even if you're not involved in the process, for all parents, they should be allowed to see the risk assessment.
Thank you, Miranda. The next question that has come in relates to availability. In this case, the school nurse has asked the parents to be available during school hours. But obviously, both parents works, and they're wondering what their options are.
So I find that a bit odd personally. I don't know the situation, but if the child is capable and able to be left in the care of the school, and the school is well enough informed in the risk assessment side of things and the specific needs, it should be the same as any child. If they are capable of looking after that child at 90% of the time and the child is fine, then the parent shouldn't have to be on call for that. If something happens, again, like with any child, you might get phoned out of work because it's a particularly urgent situation. But if the school nurse is saying that needs to be a constant on-call situation, then a conversation needs to be had about what the triggers would be for her to call them in, and see if those can be addressed. I don't know. It does sound like she's worried that there's lots of things that would crop up. And again, it might be that they've done a risk assessment that you haven't been involved with and have more worries than perhaps are necessary.
Thank you, Miranda. And coming back to accessibility, there's a question related to stair, and this in particular, there's a school that has a lot of stairs, and they're afraid that their child will miss out some of the lessons because you will have to take a lot of time going up and down the stairs throughout the day. And obviously they don't want the child to miss lessons or to be the last one in the lesson. What alternative arrangements can the school come up with to support the child?
Well, I think the first question is why is there so much moving around, and if that can be addressed. If not, it's not the best solution, but a lot of things have come out of having to be homeschooled and schools doing lessons over the computer. And again, not an ideal situation, but if it's the best you can get, if the child can be downstairs in a classroom with the lesson on Zoom and with the teacher interacting that way, or with an assistant, that is a possible solution. But I think first of all is really addressing why it's such a problem for them to keep moving all the time, why they have to be moving lessons all the time, and whether there is a possibility to bring the lessons downstairs. But yes, the one thing, living online has taught us a lot, and schools should have some more skills that they've learned over this period, to be honest.
Thank you, Miranda. And here we have a case whereby the child, unfortunately, at the moment cannot attend school, and the mum is asking whether the time that she's off to look after the child, whether she can claim any benefits. And I appreciate that you said you cannot answer those questions.
Yeah, I'm really not versed in that sort of legislation, but your Citizens Advice Bureau is usually the place I would send people to. They are quite versed in these things. If you're hitting a brick wall with them, which I know happens in everything, but some of these links, the DLA would be quite good, or even reaching out to your local council and asking why you're not getting the information that you need. If it gets to that point, that information should be freely available to you. But yes, I don't know the
answer. No, I appreciate that. And we have talked about creating a webinar specifically to support families with the DLA, and hopefully we will be able to provide that in the next forthcoming weeks. Another question that has been submitted is related to a school denying access to a child because they cannot accommodate the wheelchair. What happens then?
So that is tricky, because it really, again, it's asking more questions, but why not? And if, for example, all the corridors are too narrow for a wheelchair, that is very difficult. It would be a total rebuild. But if it is perhaps that they need someone to push them in a wheelchair, there are, again, I would reach out to Citizens Advice Bureau about funds for paying for auxiliary staff to support that. The big question is why, and then the question after that is why the school are being so difficult about it, I suppose. Schools are required to have plans to adapt for accessibility reasons, and those should be published and publicly available, and in support, done with support of the council, and they should have had an accessibility audit. But if they haven't done that does ring alarm bells of why not. Have they never been challenged before, or are they not interested? But they should have done this. The trouble is, it might not help you. The plans might be for 5 years' time, or might just be addressing a disability that isn't relevant to you. But it's worth asking the question. But at that point, I would wonder how much support you're going to get from the school anyway. And that would be a big alarm bell for me, that if the school's not willing to discuss this with me, how many more years is my child there? How difficult is every year going to be for all of us if everything is such a big debate? So sadly, yes, it would appear that the law should be on your side, but fighting it might be just another thing on your to-do list when you've got enough on already, whereas a school that's already welcoming might be a better alternative.
Thank you, Miranda. And the last questions that we have been submitted with is related to the involvement of an OT. This family, unfortunately, they're having issues in trying to get an OT involved with the school assessment. What would be an alternative?
Again, I think sometimes the why is really important here. I think if they have an OT that works with the child, why won't they do the school assessment? Are they not used to it? Do they not have the time? And finding that out, because perhaps if they're just not versed in it, that maybe they have a colleague who could support them and walk around with them. If it's because the OT is new to the child, maybe they can go with, let's say, their physio or someone who knows the child better, but perhaps with the OT who is better placed to spot issues of coordination. So things that, like the DT lab, where you have to use your hands and your feet, we tend to be separate in our clinical view. So whereas an OT sees the overall picture. If you're really struggling getting anyone who will go and do a school assessment for you, then yes, ask why. Is it not part of their procedure in the centre that you're at? And if not, sort of why not? And that would be a point at which you need to escalate. This is a real limitation for your child. Nobody in the school is well versed on it. You need some support, and the person with the expertise is not given leeway to go and visit the school. What compromise can you come to?
Thank you, Miranda. That's very useful advice, and that concludes our list of questions. For those of you that wants to submit further questions, we're more than happy then to forward them to Miranda. Please send them to info@steps-charity.org.uk. Miranda, thank you very much for your time. Much appreciate it, and thank you all of you for being with us today. Thank you.